Welcome to Action on Pain, a podcast dedicated to highlighting the significant efforts underway in Canada to address chronic pain.
By presenting perspectives from individuals who live with pain, researchers, clinicians, and other stakeholders, we explore various impacts on people's lives and the initiatives, research endeavors, and the committed professionals working to effect meaningful change.
This work is guided by Health Canada's Action Plan for Pain. Join us as we raise awareness and share stories that are shaping the future of pain management in Canada.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another extraordinary Action on Pain podcast. I'm Virginia McIntyre, and I'm joining from Nova Scotia, and I'm here today in the studio with my friends and lovely co-hosts, Keith Meldrum and Jennifer Daly-Cyr, and here to welcome someone I've known over the last couple of years. I've gotten to know Jaris, and I got to see you in Toronto this year, which was a pleasure. So I've always liked meeting up with Jaris and seeing your lovely smile and your always willingness for a great conversation.
Thanks, Virginia. And I'm Keith Meldrum, once again, coming from Kelowna, British Columbia, the beautiful Okanagan Valley, just on the tail end of what is now a 1-year-long renovation of our home. So looking forward to that being done soon. So hopefully we don't hear any banging noises or dogs barking as the renovation goes on. But always a privilege to be here with these two amazing co-hosts and really looking forward to having our conversation with Jaris today. So thanks, everybody, for joining us again.
My name's Jennifer Daly-Cyr, and I'm coming to you from almost sunny Ottawa today. And you mentioned the dog barking in the background. Always welcome Parker. I consider Parker our mascot, so that's always a delight. And I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing our guest for today, Dr. Jaris Swidrovich. Coincidentally or not, Dr. Swidrovich and I sit on the founding board for Pain Ontario together. So that's how we've gotten to know each other in the last few years. Dr. Swidrovich is an assistant professor and Indigenous engagement lead in the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto. And his pronouns are he and they. He is a Two-Spirit, Saulteaux First Nations, and Ukrainian man, and a pharmacist from the Yellow Quill First Nation. Every member of his family has lived with or still lives with chronic pain, which inspired him to be involved in the field of pain. He is the founder and chair of the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada, a founding member of Pain Ontario, a National Advisory Committee member with Pain Canada, and was a member of the Health Canada's Canadian Action Pain Task Force and Health Canada's Safer Supply of Pharmaceutical Alternatives to Street Drugs Expert Advisory Group. Thank you so much, Jaris, for being here.
Thank you.
Given your vast portfolio and your incredible experience, if you could share with our listeners a little bit about your work and your involvement with Health Canada's Action Plan for Pain in Canada.
You bet. So I've been a pharmacist since 2010 in Saskatoon, born and raised in Saskatoon, or Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homelands, but in my reservist Yellow Quill First Nation Treaty 4, and I'm joining here today from Treaty 13 or Tekaranto or Toronto, Ontario, Canada. But in Saskatoon, when I finished pharmacy school, I decided to do more pharmacy school and then moved on to Toronto to do what was called a post-baccalaureate Doctor of Pharmacy, or PharmD. And from one of my clinical placement opportunities during that time was at the Altum Health Clinic at Toronto Western Hospital, which is an outpatient chronic pain care clinic, primarily for people who are actively under a WSIB, or workers' compensation file. So people who've been injured at work, whether it was last week or 10 years ago or longer, and they were seen at this clinic in an interdisciplinary way. So that was really the first dedicated, focused time I had in the space of chronic pain. Absolutely, most patients I've seen in any other type of disease state-focused ward or clinic have lived with pain too, but that one was very specific. I moved on to then be a pharmacist at the St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatoon, where I worked with patients living with HIV. And really, I often follow up by saying they were dying from HIV, quite honestly. And unfortunately, I didn't really get to see people living with it. But of the cohort of the many people out there living with HIV, the ones that I saw were experiencing several opportunistic infections And often those infections were like osteomyelitis. So they had infections of the spine, the brain, and other areas of their body. So chronic pain was just a massive part of their experience and my care. It was awful. And then I'm happy to talk anytime, but it was mentioned in the intro that yes, each person in my family has lived with pain or still lives with pain. And for myself, I've never identified as such a person, but I know that we often have discussions about pain also being more than physical, right? So emotional, spiritual, intellectual, psychological pain. Yes, then I would say I'm a person who has lived with and still does live with like, emotional pain, being like a two-spirit queer closeted person for 34 years of my life led to a lot of pain in that way. For some reason, someone somewhere along the line put my name forward to be part of the Canadian Pain Task Force. I truly don't know why. It was not what I was known for, or I had made no leaps and bounds in the area, but there my name was. And I actually asked them if it was a mistake, if they had the right person. But it really kicked off this whole world. I think much of the rest of my career is going to stay in this space, and I'm witnessing current evolutions of what I'm doing in this space too. But Canadian Pain Task Force was absolutely wonderful, and it's so nice to know that it didn't just end and the world has moved on, but it's continuing to lead to lasting change.
We're glad and we're fortunate. I think Canada's fortunate that you were picked and that it wasn't a mistake. So thank you for that work in that. And now that you've had the privilege and you've got to see, and we've heard a little bit about the task force and the amazing work that you guys did, an expanded portfolio, shortened time frame during COVID. Like, let's just think of all of the problems to throw at you guys. And as a team, you came up with this amazing framework, which is now the action plan. So as Jen said, with the work to get through the task force and to the action plan, are there parts of your work that you do today that you see that really leverage and help move forward one or more of the goals of the action plan?
Absolutely. And some of that is even, dare I say, just the stories that I heard from so many folks throughout the process, whether it was formally collected stories or informally collected stories when people saw that I was part of this team. But particularly when we held a 2-day long series of sharing circles, community engagement that we did at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg before the pandemic was declared. We sat through ceremony together. We built on relationality. It was a really wonderful gathering with First Nations, Métis, Inuit folks living with pain and or their family members and caregivers from across the country. And although I've been privy to several stories within and outside of my family, like as my role as a pharmacist, it was really powerful to be sharing the same physical and emotional space as everybody there and hearing their stories. So I carry their stories in what I do. Some of that is teaching and learning. So as a pharmacy professor, as an educator, as an ongoing clinician, although it's not a regular part of my work, and just general mentorship in the area. So what I was most involved with in the task force was that Indigenous peoples, also 2S LGBTQ plus folks in those considerations, that acronym meaning two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and other folks who might identify as diverse in terms of their gender or sexuality. And even other folks who have been made marginalized was where I spent most of my time on the task force, and even still now, like people who are incarcerated, other what Canada defines as equity seeking or equity deserving groups like women, people of color, people with disabilities, which is also me. I live with a permanent non-visible disability. So some of my own intersecting identities were part of my work, and it really allowed me to build the relationality with people who exhibited those same intersecting identities. And so I still carry that with me, and certainly have been involved in many engagement sessions, discussions, conferences, research projects that have stemmed from the various recommendations in the action plan.
That's so powerful. There's one thing you said, and I'd like to bring back. I've always said when I've gone to talk to the universities and stuff about stories. And it's a privilege to hear someone's story. And as a peer supporter with people in pain, we hear these stories over and over. And I remind people it's a privilege. So to hear you say you carry them with you, because they're what make the difference. And being a part of the Canadian Pain Task Force, listening to those stories, bringing their experiences forward, these are the things that make change.
Absolutely.
Did you bring the stories forward to the groups? How did that evolve?
I mean, for sure, always in an ethically grounded way, understanding or appreciating which stories I have the permission to share or not. So I did not share what I am not given permission to share. For those that I had been given permission to share, or stories that might be available publicly. For example, some of the direct quotations we had, which was my idea to put in the reports from the action
Nice.
plan, was let's hear and see those specific direct quotations from people with lived and living experience. So I'm able to comment on those words and elaborate on those words a little bit more because I was there and I heard the rest of their story versus just the excerpt that was there. And certainly my sister, who had the biggest pain journey of anyone I know in a personal way, she's given me full permission to share all elements of her story too, especially if it means it's going to lead to difference. So people might hear that and understand better and maybe approach their care of or with or for people, or even just a person they might see in pain in the coffee shop line. She's given me that permission.
I think that is phenomenal to be able to carry those stories forward. And your sister's story is a remarkable one of perseverance. And she's had so much happen, and I'll let you speak to that. But I'm struck by how important those stories are and why we need to hear them, because I can say that prior to experiencing pain myself as a chronic pain situation, I had no idea. I would have been empathetic, no doubt, but I really had no idea what that story was like. And it really surprised me when I started on my own journey around it, because I was like, how does this happen? How come? And so on. So, and then so many other people that, we've connected with through the network, you, others who have information and stories to share like that. They're just absolutely so powerful. And frankly, also can be quite inspiring.
Jaris, I was just looking, if I look at the action plan, and goal number 6 really, I think, speaks to a lot of what you've just talked about. And in part, it talks about improved and equitable access to services for populations disproportionately impacted by pain. You talk a lot about the work that you do, the role that you had, sort of representing or leading, Indigenous, Métis, so many other communities that we know are disproportionately impacted. And, I have to own my own ignorance and bias. I mean, I'm a middle-aged white male, cisgendered. I don't check any of those boxes. Pain has been challenging for me. We know for these communities, it's even worse. And so I think it was really important for the action plan to really highlight on that. And from your perspective, working through the task force and the action plan, do you feel that it was really, that focus was respectful and meaningful, and not like, oh, we better make sure that we do this because we know just how terribly important it is?
It was such an enormously wonderful experience, so much
Oh.
so that I was extremely emotional after our last meeting,
Oh,
because not just because of the content and what we were focusing on, but the people. I was so impressed and remain impressed by our co-chairs, Maria and Fiona, who co-chaired the task force. I had never had leadership in any place or space that I've been part of until then, with leaders who were so wonderfully inclusive, and inclusivity was at the top of mind at all times. They were aware of everyone's accessibility needs on the task force. They, would interrupt and correct people when someone might have been misgendered, let's say. They were and are such wonderful supporters and leaders and women and people in general. So none of the discussion about equity was an afterthought. I think it fueled all of the work, whether the work was about equity or not. I often say that that's how I see the world. I'm often asked to comment on, indigeneity, queerness, disability, what have you. But no matter what I'm experiencing in the world, I still hold those identities. So I am seeing everything through these lenses, right? Because that's also the lenses with which others see me. So it being equity was part of every discussion, and we were extremely intentional about that. I was incredibly impressed.
that is phenomenal. And to hear that, and as we, as we're doing these podcasts and we we talk to others about their role in the action plan or the task force in the action plan, I'm learning so much about just how powerful and how important all that work was. I mean, I recognize my ignorance to the depth and the breadth of the action plan, but to hear you say that, it's just really, I mean, that's an incredible testament that you shared. And, it's amazing that they tapped the right person to be there. It definitely wasn't a mistake. You were there purposely and intentionally
Yes.
to carry, that message forward, because it is so critically important, not only in Canada, but throughout the world. But the action plan for Canada, has highlighted and recognized these issues. So I'm so glad to hear that.
Mhm.
I personally am so struck by the action plan and the comprehensiveness of it. The more I read it, the more I read into it, the more we learn about it through this podcast. It continues to just have such a profound effect in my mind in terms of just how critical the subject of pain is, how critical all of these facets of pain and who's affected and how. It just seems like such a powerful document. And we as a trio felt it was incredibly important to lend our little contribution
Mhm.
towards that in terms of being able to highlight and bring conversations like this to the forefront, because otherwise we don't get to read that in the report, do we? And so it's incredibly helpful and so appreciated that you've been able to share that. Great.
Absolutely. Even I recall too many times throughout my sister, in particular, her pain journey, our family describing wanting to just go outside into the middle of the street somewhere and start yelling, like, somebody help us, right? Somebody listen. And
Right.
so I can only imagine what seeing this document felt like for people, families, providers, the public,
Mhm.
to see pain so visible on a national document in that way. People were listening. We didn't have
Right.
to be yelling in the street anymore.
And I think a lot of people had said that with the ones that we've had, a couple that have been a part of the 8 people who are part of the task force, a couple of them said the same thing. We just don't want it to sit there. So
Mhm.
seeing it getting into this action plan and seeing everybody referring to, well, not but a lot of people referring to it and seeing what Pain Canada has done on their website and tracking things and with the recommendations, I don't think it's just sitting there. It is really wonderful work and it's making movement.
No kidding. That 3-year term that we all signed up for wasn't a 3-year
Right.
term. It's absolutely continued on, but thank goodness for that.
And you mentioned visibility. Isn't that one of the biggest challenges of pain? Is the very visibility of it, because so many of us may be in pain at any moment and no one would know necessarily. And so,
Exactly.
on that understanding and understanding how it affects all populations, different populations, how it affects like individuals, right down to the core individual state. I just come from a spot of thinking that education is incredibly powerful and this document has the power to educate.
And further to that, I have a question for you, Jaris. You're an educator, you're a professor, you teach. Do you find that your students are aware of the action plan? Is this something they know about? Or do you have an opportunity to introduce it to them?
I do have the opportunity to introduce it to them, thankfully. So I'm quite involved in the pain curriculum, particularly here at the University of Toronto and our interfaculty pain curriculum. I've been the keynote speaker several times and uh,
Ah,
co-writing the cases, and certainly teach elements of the discipline-specific content for pharmacy students, in which, yes, I will always talk about the action plan and the Canadian Pain Task Force and the stories of people with lived and living experience.
I think that's amazing, because that's how the movement and the knowledge really gets built. Is you're right in at the foundational level. It's a fairly new document, so to have that opportunity with the incoming students who will be the clinicians, the pharmacists of tomorrow, you're giving them that foundation to say, here's the roadmap. Like, there's a lot to deal with, and I know it's overwhelming. If you follow this, it'll help guide you through where you need to go. So that it's so great to hear that you're taking that opportunity to do that. I think that's amazing. So,
Oh,
yeah,
we're trained in that way. We live our professional lives through clinical practice guidelines. So
right.
this really resonates with the pharmacist and the learner, right? Of, yeah, here's the roadmap.
So do you take that also to, like you say, you go to your students, but what about the pharmaceutical society? Are you bringing that like to
Mm.
really to the broad across Canada, then
Absolutely.
is
I
it?
mean, of course, there might be situations where I'm invited to a particular space that has nothing to do with elements of the task force or the action plan. So, of course, not in some spots,
Right. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
certainly in areas where it makes sense. 100%. Yes. I was one of those 8 who did not want to see this on a shelf somewhere. So, the more opportunities I get to promote that, the better.
That's amazing. And let's not overlook what you just said there. One of the 8. There were 8 people on that task force.
Right.
8 people, not 18, not 80. This task force that led to the framework of the action plan was through the hard work and the dedication of 8 people. So that is truly wild and amazing.
And I have to comment on the Health Canada staff, though, too.
Mhm.
They truly, I don't know that I've had a more positive experience than this task force. I had not seen staff members, like public servants, if you will, be so wonderful in every way, shape, and form. I mourned when they were promoted and put into a different position within Health Canada. I was like, I don't want you to go anywhere. I want to keep working with you. But each new person who might have been involved at some point was equally as wonderful. I'm so blessed to have known them. And quite honestly, whether it's about pain or healthcare or not, I continue to model a lot of what I do and how I walk through life and how I teach based on how I saw these leaders do the same. The Health Canada staff, the co-chairs of the task force, and my fellow members of the task force.
That's wonderful. And through that lens, you can bring that back to you. You mentioned your family, and you can bring it back to your family. You can bring it to your students. You can bring it to the broad populations that, the many, many talks that you give. And so you're continuing to spread that word. And I would imagine with that comes hope for people because there's a plan. And if that plan is followed, lives will be so much better for all affected by pain.
I think this is the great way to wrap up today's episode. We've come pretty much to the end of our time, but Dr. Swidrovich, it's been just so exciting to hear your involvement and just such the positive involvement you had with the task force and the action plan, and then being able to operationalize that on your end in your role as an educator, and then taking a moment like this to join us today to talk about your experiences. It's been invaluable, and we love learning. And we always love to learn about the work that went into the action plan. So thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your passion, which clearly comes through in our conversation today. So thank you for being with us today.
You are most welcome. And, I will leave folks with, don't ever forget about your pharmacists and the pharmacists in your life. I will close with this plug that pharmacists are the most accessible healthcare professionals. We're often ranked number 1 or 2 of most trusted professional of any kind. More than 95% of people in Canada live within a 5-kilometer radius of at least one pharmacist. And the average patient, not person, but the average patient sees their pharmacist 14 times per year versus their primary care provider 2. So we are here, we're everywhere, we're highly trusted, and so many people use medication as part of their pain management strategy. So tap a pharmacist.
Oh, Jaris, I love that you said that because you know what? I'm one of the people who relies on my pharmacist. And, I do use medication to manage my pain, and my pharmacist and their team has been instrumental in helping me understand what works, what doesn't. They check in. It's phenomenal relationship, one that I refuse to break no matter where I move to. And the other thing is that I also had an opportunity to work with Ontario pharmacists on a project that they were working on for chronic pain. So thank you for mentioning that. I'm so glad you did, and for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaris, for being here. And we would like to thank all of you for tuning in to the Action on Pain podcast. We hope this episode has shed some light on the important work being done in Canada as guided by Health Canada's An Action Plan for Pain in Canada. Until next time.
Thank you for joining us today on Action on Pain. If you enjoyed the discussion, please follow us on your preferred podcast platform to stay updated, and please share with your networks. A 5-star rating and review would help others find our show. Your feedback is important.
This podcast does not contain any medical advice. Please consult with your doctor if you have any questions or concerns.
The Action on Pain podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Chronic Pain Network, a national research and knowledge mobilization network.
The views, opinions, and content shared by hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Chronic Pain Network or its funders.